welcome.
Thank you.
Good to see you again.
Nice to see you. Thank you.
Joanne, thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here, back in Liverpool, though I was here for the Labour Party conference, but I won't say anything about that since I don't like to intrude into private grief. And I'm slightly apprehensive because the last time I spoke in Liverpool, after I'd finished my speech, a woman came up to me and said, "Mr. Neil, your speech was absolutely superfluous." And I said, "Well, thank you very much." And she said, "Tell me, is it going to be published?" And I, being a smart-ass journalist, said, "Yes, but probably posthumously." And she looked at me and said, "I can hardly wait." So I hope to get away with a little bit more today. Now, the association very kindly offered to provide me, because I'm in a bit of a rush today, got to get back for tonight's show, with the autocue, teleprompter, as they call in America, to make it easier for me to deliver my remarks to you. But I said to the association, please don't waste your money. We have the autocue every program on the BBC with the script all beautifully written there, and I still manage to screw it up every couple of weeks. It was only about 4 months ago I ran into the studio, and late as usual, earpiece in, microphone attached, sit down as the opening title's coming to an end and say, "Welcome to the Daily Politics. Today we go live to Manchester to speak to Elizabeth Stewart," and I'm just reading this off the autocue, I've got no idea what I'm saying, "who is 111. This rather attractive middle-aged woman pops up on the monitor, and I think, well, I know Manchester's doing well, but what are they putting in the water? That's incredible. And as I'm thinking of this, in a nanosecond, the producer shouts in my ear, "Who is ill, you pillock, ill?" So now you see why I'm here in Liverpool, not doing the BBC today. The following week, they sent me to Israel. And when you're on location, you don't have the autocue, you have a camera person and a producer. And we had been doing some pretty heavy stuff, as you imagine, but on the Friday, the main holiday there in Israel, we decided we'd do something a bit lighter. And I was just preparing my thoughts to lead into the little film we had shot. I was looking at the camera, and suddenly in my ear from the gallery in London, I hear the producer shouting at me. He said, "Andrew, for God's sake, you're live on network television. Don't just stand there like a complete numpty. Say something." And being the consummate professional, I looked up from my notes, looked straight down the lens of the camera, and said, "Welcome to Jerusalem, a Mecca for tourists." So now you see why I'm here tonight, not running the Tel Aviv Tourist Board. I'm going to speak a little bit about the government's Brexit strategy, as much as we know about it, what the environment in Europe will be as this strategy is implemented, something that is undercovered in this country and will be just as crucial as the environment in Britain. I'm then going to look at what the uncertainties might be. I'm going to look a bit at what the global environment is going to be as all of this takes place, a little bit about the US election, a little bit about the autumn statement, and then finish up with just some thoughts of my own about what kind of policies we should now be discussing. When I come to the American election, I'll obviously be talking about Mr. Trump and Mrs. Clinton, though I got an idea of the attitude recently of Buckingham Palace to Mr. Trump when the head of intelligence at MI6 was doing his regular briefing with the Queen, and they came to an end, and as the Queen was leaving, the head of SIS said, "Ma'am, I forgot, what about Mr. Trump?" And the Queen just looked round at him and said, "Tell 007 to make it look like an accident." Though I fear 007 will have no need to do that now. If you look at what was said during the campaign by both the Remain side and the Leave side, if you look at everything government ministers have said since, particularly the Brexit ministers, they have said that Leave means we leave the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, the ECJ, which adjudicates on all matters of the European Union. We would take back control of our borders, including migrants from the European Union, and we would have the freedom to make our own free trade agreements, bilateral agreements with other countries. Now, Any one of these issues on its own means you can't be a member of the single market. Take all three together, and there is no way you can be a member of the single market. Of course, you will still have access to the single market, and that's what the argument will be of how much access. Everybody has access to the single market. Even North Korea has access to the single market, as does the United States. But what are the terms of that access is what now has to be decided. And not being in the single market, if we maintain these three things that we think leave means it is impossible to stay in the single market. You take the customs union, which is the ability of the European Union to set up tariff borders around the European Union to the rest of the world. You cannot be inside that and make your own free trade agreements. We have to come out if that is what we want to do. And what has puzzled me, and of course, we've had both sides reluctant to admit that since June the 23rd. The Remain, the loser side, has kind of grabbed membership of the single market as a fallback position, even though David Cameron and George Osborne made it clear, we have it on BBC tape at the time, made it clear that if we vote to leave, we're voting to leave the single market. More puzzling has been, why has the government not been quite explicit in ruling out membership of the single market and admitting that it is the degree of access that we're now going to have that is up for debate. And I think the reason for that is that the government's negotiating strategy is fundamentally going to be to ask for the moon on a stick. It is just going to ask for everything when Article 50 is triggered. Doing so in the full knowledge that it won't get everything, but going to ask for everything, even saying implicitly that we can do all this on the ECJ, on making our own trade agreements, on ending free movement of migrants. We can do all that and still have some kind of membership of the single market. And part of the reason they're going to do that is that they want to stake out the negotiations to start on their ground. And then as they concede that that cannot be, they think the European leaders' ability to say, we've knocked the Brits back on that, will then allow the European leaders to dine out on that and then get the negotiations onto a more even keel. Now, the strategy is also highly influenced by the European electoral cycle, and this is what hasn't really had enough coverage in this country. When we trigger Article 50, by the end of March next year, by the end of the first quarter, the French presidential election will already be well underway. And they do it in two parts, and that will go way on into May before we know who the new French president is. And nothing will happen during that period of time, because if the French were to agree to give us anything in the negotiations, both Madame Le Pen, who will probably come first in the first round of the presidential election, and Mr. Sarkozy, if he is the Republican candidate for that election, will say, if the Brits can have that, why can't we have it? Both Mr. Sarkozy and Madame Le Pen will run on highly Eurosceptic platforms. So there is no way the French government can give anything this side of the French election. And the British know that. And then you effectively, from May, you may get some agreements, or not agreements, but some talks going. But before you know it, you're into August, when Brussels and Paris close down, and the German election cycle begins. And then the Germans, both parliamentary, chancellorship elections take place. They may be a little bit more helpful because the voice of big business in the German election will be against Britain getting a punishment beating. But again, we can do very little until these German elections are out of the way. And that doesn't happen until mid-September. And by the time a new government is formed, you're almost at this time next year. So very little will happen between now and this time next year in terms of substantive discussions. When I put that to one cabinet minister to say, so really nothing is going to happen, he said there is one thing that we can do, and that is that we can start to line up and brief and have talks with the East European members of the European Union and the Scandinavian members of the European Union, who are in general more sympathetic to our case. So we can start to line up some of the smaller members of the EU before the big ones come into play, not before this time next year. So get the smaller, friendlier nations on side. But it means that the substantive talks, in my view, don't get underway till about this time next year, and that will spill well into 2018, and we all know that in European talks, it's the final 3 months that really matter. So that you will not start to see major deals, major things coming out of these talks till well into 2018. And there's a complicating factor on this as well. Never mind our own political situation, never mind the divisions within the government and the difficulty the government will have coming to an agreed negotiating position. The situation in Europe is even more complicated, indeed even more parlous. It takes place at a time when all the mainstream parties in the democratic parts of Europe are under enormous threat, when the centre is not holding, when there are fissiparous tendencies in nearly every major democracy, from Greece in the southeast of our continent, which now has the first democratically elected Marxist government in Europe since the end of the Second World War, through Hungary and Poland, both run by governments of the hard right, nativist, anti-immigrant, anti-German, anti-Brussels, through into Finland, which has also moved to the right as well, beyond the normal centre-right, even cuddly social democratic progressive Sweden, the third largest party there, holding the balance of power, are called the Sweden Democrats, not the Social Democrats, and they are again a hard right, anti-immigrant nativist party, through into France, where Madame Le Pen of the National Front, as I say, will almost certainly come first in the first round of elections and then face a runoff with probably Mr. Sarkozy or Mr. Juppé, into Spain, which has now had 2 general elections and still hasn't a government because the centre-left has collapsed, as it has in Greece, into Portugal, which has got a weak socialist in government, kept in power by the communists, into Italy, which is facing a constitutional referendum in December the 4th, in which Mr. Renzi, the sort of Tony Blair of Italian politics, has said if he loses that, he will resign. So if you look at all that, if you look at what is happening in the European demos, you can see that they have other fish to fry. Brexit may be important to them. The negotiations will certainly be, but they have other major issues that concern them that come ahead of an agreed negotiating position. If Mr. Renzi loses his constitutional referendum on December the 4th, there is a huge risk that could spark off an Italian banking crisis. Italian banks are the walking wounded. European rules have not allowed them to be recapitalized. The non-performing loans on Italian balanced bank sheets are now £350 billion, equivalent to 18% of Italy's GDP. You can see how precarious that is. And of course, it's not just the Italians. Deutsche Bank is in huge trouble. Commerzbank is in huge trouble as well. There are many other problems that the Europeans will have to deal with. Luxembourg has called for Hungary to be kicked out of the European Union because of its attitude to migration quotas. The response of Hungary in a polite audience like this is not possible to repeat about Luxembourg, but it goes along the lines of German pit stop for tanks on their way to Paris kind of thing. That's the kind of mood that there is in Europe at the moment, and the many other issues that the Europeans will have to face. The Visegrad group of countries, which is the East European countries, the Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, they now want major treaty change to repatriate powers from Brussels back to national capitals. The French and the Germans would like treaty change like a hole in the head. It just is too difficult to do. So the problem that we will face, even when we come to determine our negotiating strategy, is not just getting the Europeans to determine theirs, but getting Europe's attention. There are so many other issues on the European agenda. The migration crisis, Mr. Putin on maneuvers on the eastern flank of Europe, that Brexit, as important it is to us, is not actually the number one item on the agenda of the rest of Europe. So it's difficult. This means that we, as a nation, will experience uncertainty for quite some time to come. Now, most of the economic predictions in the short run that were made during the referendum campaign have turned out to be untrue. We have not slid into a recession, as the Bank of England predicted, and so did the Treasury and the IMF. House prices have not collapsed by 18%, as Mr. Osborne predicted when he was Chancellor. It turns out that our economy is growing more quickly than any other G7 country. House prices are still rising, and retail sales, which just came out today, are the strongest they've been for several years. So far, so good. But there are concerns about next year, particularly with this kind of uncertainty. Inflation is clearly on the rise. It reached 1%, still very low, still only 50% of the bank's target. But it's undoubtedly, with the fall in the pound, more inflation will creep through in 2017. And the one thing that is keeping this economy afloat is very strong consumer spending. Now, if inflation creeps up above 2%, say towards 3%, but average wages are still rising by only just over 2%, as they are now, the danger there, that is a squeeze on real incomes. Prices are rising faster than incomes, whereas that's not the case at the moment. That could put a squeeze on consumer spending. And I think because of the uncertainty, I think even the most rabid lever would have to admit that a number of business investment projects and a number of foreign direct investment projects are bound to be put on hold until we see the lie of the land. Now, when you take that into account, that is why there is a 1% consensus. I don't mean that only 1% agree. I mean that there's a consensus that the economy is likely to grow by only 1% next year. Now, I'm always a little bit suspicious of consensus. I think myself it actually could be better than that. But there is a sense, a general feeling that the economy will not grow so fast next year as it did this year. Though, mind you, that is true of many major economies. The IMF has done a general downgrade. But that is a consequence of a creeping inflation and of a squeeze on consumer spending. Now, all this is taking place at a time when there is a major recalibration of global economic policy taking place. And it will have huge implications for all major economies, including our own. Since the great crash of 2008, which lumbered most Western countries with unsustainable fiscal deficits and soaring national debt, macroeconomic policy was essentially outsourced to the central banks. There was very little the politicians could do about it. They were cribbed and confined. Most of them were under pressure to cut their fiscal deficits. They couldn't go in for massive pump priming, and they were therefore had their hands tied. So they handed it over to the central banks, and we know that the central banks slashed interest rates, went in for massive QE of the electronic printing of money, which reached a stage where, of course, interest rates have gone down so much that a quarter of the world's sovereign bonds are now paying negative interest rates. If you want the privilege of owning a Swiss corporate bond or a Swiss sovereign bond or a Japanese sovereign bond, you will need to pay the Swiss or the Japanese governments for the privilege of buying their debt. This, of course, has had the impact in Japan. The one thing you cannot now get in Japan is a safe, because everyone has bought safes to take their money out of the bank so they don't have to pay them and stick it in their safe in the homes. So if you want to get into a good growing business, get into Japanese safes at the moment. Now, what the central banks never thought, and neither did the politicians, because this all started in 2008, that 8 years later, in 2016, it would still be the central banks doing the heavy lifting. Interest rates would still be at record lows, quantitative easing would still be out there, and in some cases with the ECB or Japan, extended. But there's a problem with this. When you get into negative interest rates, you meet massive resistance, and you undermine the balance sheets of the banks. because they can make no money out of interest. And there is only so much further you can go. And QE is subject to the law of diminishing returns, that you do the first 350 billion of QE, it can have a reflationary effect on the economy. Do another 50 billion, not so much. You just don't get the same impact. And as I look around the world now, starting with the Bank of Japan, where Governor Kuroda was told not to do any more great QE or negative cutting of interest rates, that fiscal policy would have to come back on stream, through to the United States, where Janet Yellen is now trying to raise rates, but has been unable to do so this year, partly because it's been an election year, but where the American fiscal deficit is up over 30% on last year, back to fiscal policy, through to the ECB, where Mr. Draghi today, as I was coming here, said he did not know if QE could be extended any further. And indeed, there is a massive constraint on further QE from the ECB because it has wreaked havoc with the German banking and insurance systems. And there is huge pressure from the Germans now not to go further down this road. And the Bundesbank is the most important stakeholder in the ECB. And I think that's why Mr. Draghi said, I will tell you in December if there is going to be any more QE after March of next year. Again, you see also the austerity policies of the European Commission are now being loosened. Portugal and Spain are now in clear breach of them, but the Commission has virtually done nothing. A move to fiscal policy and away from the reliance on central banks. And I think that that has the implication that you are now beginning to see the turn in the interest rate cycle. It will be slow, it won't happen overnight, but bond yields are starting to rise again. Mrs. Yellen is going to try to do her best to get these interest rates going up again, and fiscal policy once again comes to the fore. And that is going to be a huge change, and you will see that above all in the autumn statement from Chancellor Hammond on November the 23rd. Because the governor of the Bank of England has said, implied in public but stated very clearly in private, that monetary policy has run its course, and what ammunition he still has left in the locker he needs to hold back in case we're hit with a recession next year. So fiscal policy moves again center stage. The deficit reduction ceases to be the priority in the short term, and I think you will in the autumn statement see a modest rise in infrastructure expenditure. Not a huge rise, but a modest rise. Not the grand projet, as the French would call them, of HS2 or the Heathrow runway, but probably a lot more road building, a lot more upgrading of rail, and an increase in the pressure to build more homes, what politicians like to call shovel-ready jobs, Keynesian pump priming rather than long-term infrastructure investment. But Mr. Hammond is a fiscal conservative. He does not like to go too far on these things. Mrs. May would like to go much further. So I think although you will see a change, it will be a change of emphasis rather than a watershed change. But you will see fiscal policy coming to the fore again. Now, I mentioned that the American deficit had started to rise again, and the fiscal policy was playing a bigger role there. Of course, we don't know what American policy will be, economic policy, until we get an idea of the election result. On that, I would say that it is clear that the Access Hollywood tapes of Mr. Trump's private views on various women were a watershed in this election campaign. As we came out of the conventions and went into September, and the campaign didn't really start proper, as it never does, until Labor Day, which is the first Monday in September, Mr. Trump was actually narrowing the gap that Mrs. Clinton had come out of her convention in Philadelphia with. He was closing her opinion poll lead. And for a while, the polls were pretty much within the margin of error. And then came the Access Hollywood tapes and the subsequent Mr. Trump reaction to it. And it is clear now that Mrs. Clinton has a pretty decent lead in the national polls now. The latest one I was looking at with the Real Clear Politics poll of polls, it's about 6.5%. In some ways, on this side of the Atlantic, people wonder why her lead isn't even greater. And I think the reason for that is that Mrs. Clinton is actually the most unpopular presidential candidate in American history, except for Donald Trump. But more important than the national polls is when you drill down to the states, because the national polls are quite misleading, and what chooses the next president is not the overall popular vote, it's the electoral college and the number of votes each of the states have. And Mrs. Clinton pretty much has a lock on a sizable chunk of the electoral college vote. You need 270 to win. She has already got about 230, 240. And the more you look at this, you can see several ways that Mrs. Clinton can become president of the United States. There is only one route to the White House for Donald Trump, and that is that he has to win every southern state, every state in what we used to call the antebellum South, the old slave states of the South. He has to win every one there, possibly bar Virginia, because that is becoming less of a southern state. It's being colonized by Washington, D.C. in the north. And every one of the Rust Belt states, from what is essentially America's Middle England, from Green Bay on the shores of Lake Michigan, all the way through to Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. He has to win Ohio. He's nip and tuck there. He has to win Wisconsin. She's ahead there. He has to win Indiana. He probably will win Indiana. But he has to win Pennsylvania. No Republican has won Pennsylvania since 1988, and he's 10 points behind in Pennsylvania. So the window is closing on Mr. Trump's route to the White House, and I think it is now clear that it is Mrs. Clinton's to lose. And indeed, on the night, the Electoral College, if not the popular vote, could actually give Mrs. Clinton quite a substantial lead. But I'll just caveat, this is the year of the unexpected, and the unexpected can happen. And such is the crashing of the Trump campaign that Republicans are now more concerned that they could now lose the Senate as well. They're unlikely to lose the House, but they could lose the Senate. Democrats need 4 victories to take the Senate, assuming Mrs. Clinton is the president. 5 if she's not, because then her vice president wouldn't be vice president and wouldn't have the casting vote in the Senate. I think it is touch and go. A month ago, I would have said there was no chance the Republicans can get the Senate. Now, I'm not so sure. It is at least a possibility. So Mrs. Clinton becomes president, but, and here is the issue, it is likely, if not certain, that whoever the next president of the United States is over the next 4 years will need to deal with a downturn in the American economy. The current American recovery is 88 months old, which is long by post-war American standards. Now, recoveries don't die of old age, but they often die when people get things wrong, politicians and policymakers. And if there isn't a recession in the next 4 years in America, that will be the longest American recovery since reliable records began in 1854. So it's at least a fair assumption that we should be ready for a recession in the United States, which will have a huge impact on Britain and on the Eurozone at a time when neither fiscal policy nor monetary policy are really fit for purpose to deal with another recession, which is why I think Janet Yellen, the chair of the Fed, will come under huge pressure not to raise rates in December of this year, because it could just tip America over into recession. And you could have a circumstance where you have a very divided America. 45 million people have voted for Mr. Trump. They loathe Hillary Clinton. How does she bring the country together? Even if she takes the Senate, or her party takes the Senate, she does not take the House, which is where all the finance bills are determined, tax and spend. And even if she takes the Senate, She loses it in 2018 in the midterm elections when there are 25 Democratic senators up for re-election, and if a recession has clicked in, this will not be a time to be up for re-election. So you could have a very divided Washington, a very divided country, and an untested on economic policy president who cannot command the support of Congress. And that is what makes the next 4 years, I think, quite difficult for whoever wins the White House, even for a safety-first, more predictable president like Mrs. Clinton. And finally, just to finish up, there's very little we can do about a lot of that. There's very little we can do about European politics. There's very little we can do about the American election or even about a recession in America. But it seems to me that the country needs to reconsider what its political debate is about. There seems to be a desire on both sides of the Remain and Leave campaigns to carry on fighting the referendum, to keep on going over all the arguments. And that's a natural tendency. There are some leavers who are more comfortable doing that than actually doing the hard work of leaving. And there are many Remainers who say that they accept the result, but privately they don't, and would like to do what they can to undermine it. But it seems to me that we now need to move to an agenda which will prepare this country for being out of the European Union and for whatever global winds begin to hit it. Now, it is not for me at the BBC to have my own agenda, but let me throw out just some ideas that maybe this country should spend more time debating and less time debating about when Article 50 is or isn't going to be triggered. If, as I've said, business investment is going to fall and foreign direct investment with it because of the uncertainty, is there not a strong case for government moving strongly into that vacuum and filling it with a substantial program of infrastructure investment? Not a couple of billion, but a major program to improve the infrastructure of this country, improve the supply side of the economy, and make sure that the fall in business investment doesn't work through to lower growth. Is there not a job for government to do that? And what kind of government investment should it be? We've had this argument recently about grammar schools. As a product of a grammar school, I still have a warm recollection of my time there. But if we are now to go global and compete with the world, rather than grammar schools, do we not need a minimum of 100 new elite schools teaching the STEM skills? Science, technology, engineering, mathematics, all the skills that we are short of. And if we are going to control our borders, many of the people coming in have these skills. If we're going to stop some coming in, do we not need to start equipping our children with the kind of skills that they will need to prosper and the kind of skills this country will need if it's going to make a go of being out of the European Union? We haven't built a new runway in the southeast of England for 50 years. So instead of agonizing about one at Heathrow, why not one at Heathrow, one at Gatwick, and why not one in Birmingham too, because we've neglected our regional airports. If we really mean to go global and provide direct links, not just to Beijing, not just to New Delhi, but to all the major provincial markets in these huge emerging markets, do we not need to think big? We have an enormous housing shortage. One of the ways this country got going in the 1930s was a massive house building program. Do we not need that again? And do we not need also to think that among that, if we are to provide, if we are to shift in favor of ordinary working people, do we not need the equivalent of a massive council house building program as well? And if we really mean to rebalance this country between the south and the north, is it not more important to build state-of-the-art communications between South Yorkshire and where we are today in Lancashire than spend 50 billion on HS2? Would 50 billion in the north not revolutionize and create a proper northern powerhouse and to give priority outside London, the southeast, to that kind of infrastructure spending? Now, some of these ideas are good, some are bad. It's not for me to say. But it seems to me that is the kind of things we should be talking about if we are to equip this country for a post-Brexit future. If we carry on with all the old arguments, the world will have overtaken us and we won't be in any condition to do so. So I think maybe our politicians need, on the left, the right, and the centre, need to start thinking, what does this country need to do to equip itself for the 2020s, rather than fight the battle that ended in June of this year. Thank you very much.